welcome back to another episode of Debt Collection 101. We are here for our second part of the series with Mary Shores. Mary, thank you for being back here again with us today. If you haven't checked out the first part, go check it out. We'll link it up above for you guys. But today, in this section, we are going to be talking more and diving into training your collectors and investing in your collector training. So, Mary, would you like to just give a quick recap on where we're coming from today and where we started off last time?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm definitely enjoying this four-part series on the compassionate collection framework because I feel like this is really the beginning of creating a survival guide for collection agencies in these like really uncertain and unprecedented times. And I think there's some really amazing things coming down for us that's going to just up level everyone. And so today we're really talking about the second element of the framework, which is the onboarding of the actual collectors. And it's not even really just about collectors, but how do we onboard our teams and make sure that they are trained in three very specific areas, which are negotiation, critical thinking, and communication. And there's actually a fourth of emotional intelligence, which we covered that much more in the first video of the series.
Awesome. And I know one of the things that we kind of touched on in that first video was this, I almost want to call it a battle back and forth in some agency owners' mind of like, can you really invest in this training and have it be beneficial for your agencies without it negatively affecting revenue and, not having it be this huge expense? I guess from your perspective, with that in mind, where do you see these deficiencies currently in operations for training people in the industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm really fortunate because I do a lot of calls with many different agencies around the country and actually now even around the world. And in my experience, what I'm observing is very little attention paid to training and onboarding of new collectors. It seems to range from very little training, which consists of, especially for smaller companies, because I think that, it's in the collection industry as a small company myself. Oftentimes I don't feel like I have access to the latest and greatest because, I don't have as much of a budget. And so what I see, especially with small companies, when most collection agencies are small companies with like less than, probably less than 50 employees. So they don't really have the luxury of having a full-time trainer. And so I'm seeing habits that consist of, say, for example, training a new collector on the FDCPA, training them on some compliance and how to use the computer and how to use, the different software and technology. And then when they learn their skill sets for the job, oftentimes they're paired with the veteran collector. And the idea here is that we want the new collector to shadow with the more seasoned personnel. Now, this is troublesome and outdated because new collectors don't really have this proper structure outside of learning the FDCPA and some compliance rules about, and also, how their software works. So additionally, they're also going to be put in a position to replicate habits from the veteran collector that perhaps these are habits that we really prefer this that we not see on the collection floor. So, and then, that's kind of at the lower end of the spectrum. And I'm talking to managers and owners all the time that tell me their wish list. I wish we had this kind of training. I wish we had that kind of training. And so really in today's world, because there's so much online training available, 80% of companies have already invested in some kind of online learning for their staff. And I find that it's really easy to fill that deficiency, even for small companies, because, rather than having to pay the expense of hiring a head trainer and, having them build out a program, you can utilize online training and get it done at a fraction of the cost. And actually, the reality is that the knowledge retention is a really higher in online learning versus like a classroom learning. And I think that's because with online learning, you can really take advantage of like micro learning. Whereas if you're learning at the office, it's probably going to be like a half a day training. And so you're just not going to retain as much more or as much of the information. And then on the other side of that spectrum, I really see companies, like really amazing companies that have the luxury of fully built out training departments, where they have an onboarding procedure. My company, even though it's small, we have an onboarding procedure. I call it business boot camp. And it's just, my special blend of when someone's new to this industry, this is what, and I have like literally an agenda that's hour by hour for the first minimum 3 weeks of their employment.
Wow.
And they're not even going to touch a conversation with a consumer until they've gotten through a significant portion of that. So in those bigger companies that have bigger budgets, they definitely have the luxury of having a full-time trainer, having lots of reference material, having I think that I talk to a lot of agency owners, and it causes them anxiety, just the thought of having the collectors off the phone for training. So one of the deficiencies is we need to just accept that they do need to be off the phone for a little while in order to get proper training.
So you mentioned earlier a few different, three different areas, I believe it was, that agencies should focus their training efforts on. Could you go into those a little bit more, talk about them a little bit more?
Sure. So, I think the first one to talk about is critical thinking skills. So often there are so many issues that can be avoided if the collector had a little bit more room to think on their feet. And oftentimes I have talked to collection managers, and, Alex, you've been in the industry long enough yourself that you've probably heard conversations like this. Seasoned collectors say, I have an instinct. Or I'll talk to collection managers and they'll talk about their debt collection instincts. And oftentimes they'll even go into great detail about how they learned these instincts when they were a child because they had a paper route and they had to go, door to door to collect the paper route subscription money. Well, that all built up these critical thinking skills. So instincts, if you're an owner and you think that you can't train on instincts, we need to switch that belief up a little bit. The reality is we can actually teach some critical thinking skills. And when we allow and empower collectors with simple critical thinking, like step-by-step process decision-making skills, what we're really doing is empowering them to solve the problem on their own with the consumer without having to push the big red button that they need a supervisor, because supervisor calls are more costly than regular agent calls. And also, going back on training, if supervisors and team leaders didn't have to take so many escalated calls, well, then they would have more time to focus on training. So critical, one of the best, like simplest critical thinking skills, I think, is the OODA loop. I talk about it a lot. It just means it's a military strategy. It means observe, orient, decide, and act. And that has helped me, that acronym has helped me so much, especially during COVID, because whenever I was pressed to make a decision, I step back and I'm like, what are all the facts? What am I observing? And then, okay, I take a moment to orient myself, like to ground myself, like where do I fit in the situation, or where does my agency fit in the situation? And if we just kind of like let these answers sort themselves out, we can have a set of options presented to us, and then we make a conscious choice about which action we're going to take with the consumer. What I see a lot of, instead of observe, orient, decide, and act, what I see a lot of in the industry is react. Consumer said this: react, react, react. It's act, react. I don't see a lot of thinking in between. And so honestly, that sort of reacting and getting triggered by what the consumer says is what lands the call in the boxing ring, where it just seems like you've got the consumer and the collector and they both have their boxing gloves on.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point that you made about critical thinking specifically. And I think what's really interesting to me, when we think about all these skills for collectors, like negotiation, critical thinking, communications, like there's something so human about all of these things. And, I mean, we work for a software company. I'm a science nerd. I love all these new emerging technologies. And I think like there's this one part of the industry that you could look at and you could say like, oh, we're moving towards virtual agents or we're moving towards AI. And that stuff's really exciting and it's great. But I think what's so special is like this human element of these skills that are, so specific to what an agent can do compared to these other technologies. When we're looking at something more like negotiation, what skills sets have you seen be effective for training this? And do you think that it's something that can be kind of learned over time by these agents?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that collectors and agents can leave a lot of money on the table because they tend to negotiate from the bottom up. So what I mean by that is the consumer throws out an offer, maybe $25 or $50, and the collector sort of gets trapped by that because they don't really know how to respond. And so if they respond in the way that I see is common, they might say something like, "No, I'm sorry, we can't accept that offer. It's too low." Okay. And I'm not saying every agent says that. And I'm not even saying there's anything wrong with it. What I am saying is it's not a good negotiation strategy to be trapped at the bottom numbers, right? So what we want to do is we want to reverse that by knowing how to respond when the consumer says $25, so that we're now looking at negotiation from the top down instead of the bottom up. Because if I could wave the magic wand right now and make everyone's life easier, that would be the thing I would do, is to say, teach your collectors how to negotiate and then role play it with them. Because the moment you can change that, you can double to quadruple their average monthly payment amount. So if a collector sets up people on an average arrangement of $57 a month, well, what if that was $302 a month as their average? And how would that elevate your overall revenue? Well, it's a game changer, and it's actually in everyone's best interest, because consumers, I don't want to ever have anyone think that I believe that my strategies here are to put, basically let the consumer do whatever they want, because that's not the point. My personal philosophy is that debt needs to be ripped off like a Band-Aid. And I'm going to tell you why. Because Caitlin, if I asked you something that you had to pay, if I asked you something that you had to pay like a few years ago, and it was something that you didn't want to have to pay, you would be able to think of something, but it might take you a few seconds, right? And you're probably not all like, triggered by it anymore because it's in the past, right? But what if I asked you, what if you were still paying $25 a month on that? Every time you make that payment, it's just a reminder of that thing that you wanted to go away, right? So that's like a big explanation about negotiation. And the only reason I'm saying it that way is because really it is in the best interest of the consumer to get the account paid in the fastest method possible. That is my truth. I'm sticking to it, right? Because this account is on their credit report and it's showing as unpaid. And so it is in the consumer's best interest. And collectors are intimidated. They're intimidated in that negotiation because they're so afraid of being told no. We need to train our collectors that it's a good thing to be told no. This is another area where Chris Voss and I agree. From the beginning of my career, I always told collectors, I don't care how many yeses you get. I want you to tell me how many no's you got. Because if you get, so I used to have this game, like 99 no's, you get 99 no's a day, you're going to do great. And my rule was you always had to get 3 no's on every call. Well, what would happen is, they wouldn't get 3 no's because on the third time they asked, the consumer would pay. And so it's really, any strategy is better than having no strategy. And what I see a lot of is like people taking tips and tricks off the internet, and they try to like piece together a strategy, but it's not really cohesive. So if we can get consistent on like a company-wide collection strategy, not only is that going to boost our results with the collectors, it's also something that you can market. You can market to your clients that you have this strategy that you're using, and they will be very happy. Because to be honest with you, one thing that has me scratching my head sometimes, it's like, hello, your client could have set them up on $25 a month. They didn't need you for that, right? Like, you don't need me to set your consumer up on $25 or $50 a month, because you could have done that yourself. And then you didn't have to pay commission.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds biased saying it, because we're on this side of the fence of being in the collections industry, but it is really a relief when that's paid off. I mean, all of us, I'm sure, have had it. I've had it. Pay that big credit card balance, and it's when it's gone, it's like, whew, it feels
Whoa.
good, you know. So, yeah, one thing that you mentioned earlier was critical thinking skills. So, what can agency and you highlighted it a little bit, but what can agencies do to sharpen a collector's critical thinking skills? What else can they do?
You know, I have lessons on it in the Collection Advantage course where we teach them like step-by-step processes of decision making, and that seems to help a lot, as far as like what the goal is. And so I think that if I were just trying to build this myself, I would start breaking down decisions to say like, you know, to kind of like reverse engineer the solution, the strategy out of the solution you want. So that's one of the things that I do is like I teach this process. I call it focus on the outcome, but it's like where we think about this consumer and what do we want the outcome of the situation to be. So this is kind of like a higher level technique because maybe the consumer has already made a complaint or is calling to complain, or they have an issue with the bill, and then it becomes like we have to sort of figure this out. Right. Well, if we can gather up all the facts of the situation, okay, without the emotion, okay, because here's the thing: collectors and supervisors and team leads, they can get all really wrapped up in the emotion of the situation. Oh, well, that guy was really rude, or it's not about that. Just the facts, ma'am, like on that old TV show, just the facts. So you can create a little bit of a timeline. And then once you see the timeline, you can also ask yourself the question, what is it the consumer really wants? Because oftentimes consumers will have an agenda that they don't share because they are afraid. They're afraid of trusting us with what what they truly want. So oftentimes, a consumer might call up and say that they want XYZ when what they really want is just the account off their credit report. Or, maybe they need help getting their insurance to pay a bill and they're just struggling with that. But they may not say that because we kind of like hold our true intentions like behind the curtain, so to speak. So if we ask ourselves, what is the consumer's motivation in this request? It can really then help us figure out what's the closest we can get to what the consumer needs. Sometimes I literally just ask the consumer, like, what would be the best case solution to this issue? And that's when they'll get to talking, and that's when they'll start to tell me what they really want. And most consumers are very honest people just trying to dig themselves out of a jam, just like we were when we had to pay that thing we didn't want to pay.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the points that we keep hitting back on that I love is kind of hitting those consumers with those questions of like, how do you feel? And really opening them up to these questions that maybe other people aren't asking them, and really opening up that stream of communication. I know, one phrase I think everyone is familiar with, whether it's your mom or a boss or a teacher telling it to you, is communication is key. Like we hear that all the time, but that's, it's such a broad term, like communication is key. And thinking about that, like for an agency who wants to prioritize communication on their team, and they're watching your training, they believe in what you're saying, but how I guess how should they approach that in a way that isn't so broad? Like how can they break that down and actually make that large task of communication a really actionable training item?
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. I think it's a mindset shift again, because first of all, no matter the size of anyone's agency out there, whether, we've even had companies contact us and they were literally like a one-man show. And that's okay because that's how I started. I started in my dining room all by myself. I didn't have any team to rely on. So I like to look at it this way. No matter the size of your company, you are still a call center. Why? Because the work that we're doing is phone work primarily. Okay. So it's to understand that the power of that person's voice who's speaking to the consumer is the most valuable asset in the industry. And often it's the least one that's invested in. So if we consider that our, as an industry, our whole goal is to collect past due receivables, and it's typically done through the medium of communication of a debt conveyed by any medium, right? Whether it's the mail or email or text messaging or over the phone, it's still considered a communication via the FDCPA. So that's our one main activity. And so how can that be our one main activity without communication being our number one priority? It's kind of like ironic, right? Like, how have we, but I think that we do put it together. It's just that it's time to upgrade it a little bit. So I think the first part is see your agency as a call center, no matter the size. And that the number one way you can create a more valuable asset is to become the best at your trade. And that means what is being said on the actual calls from the call center. And remember that I believe that really what's being said to consumers should be no different than if I personally, Mary Shores, the CEO of my agency, is talking to that consumer, because it's really my voice that should set the tone of that entire call center.
So we hinted at this a little bit in the first framework, but what are the real life outcomes of a well trained collections team?
Well, I hope that the number one thing is higher recoveries, right? We've seen as high as a 60% increase. So the better we communicate, the more we are connecting our communication, the more money that we're going to get. I mean, that's just, listen, that has to be the ROI right there. That's the number one thing. The next big one is shortening the runway time. So like, for example, what we have experienced is that there's a real hiring crunch. I've done a couple of events now with Tracy on your team where we're talking about hiring in the industry. We're talking about things like, the fact that especially the younger crowd, they want to work for impact brands. They want to work for companies that are moving humanity forward instead of costing humanity in its ethics. You know what I mean? And that's so important it should be important to all people. I see it being especially, like, my son's 19 years old. This is so important to him. So the thing is that if someone takes a collection job, okay, it might not be the job that they wanted in their heart. And that's okay, because they're open to a new career at the very least. But imagine how defeating that is for that person when they're compared to the veteran collectors and they're not performing. It takes them a long time. It takes a lot of runway to get a new collector to perform at the same level as a veteran collector, right? That's a known struggle in the industry. So what if we could do something where we create a spectacular onboarding process, that we're training these new hires in a very different way that brings their proficiency, brings their value up in a manner of 2 to 6 weeks instead of 3 to 6 months. That has been a huge win with especially like people going through the Collection Advantage program. And in some cases, we're even seeing the new collectors outperform the veteran collectors. And so I just think that if you're a new collector and you're not making like commission or bonus within 90 days, it feels defeating, and it causes that person to start looking outside for another job. And so this is huge. It's a huge cost to the employer, because every time you invest in hiring someone and then they don't work out, that money, you might as well have just flushed it down the toilet.
Yeah, I know, we talk to so many people, and hiring it's a huge issue in our industry, and it's hard. I don't think anyone grows up saying, "Hey, I want to be a debt collector." But with that said, I for anyone out there watching this who maybe is new to the industry or looking at those job applications out there, it's a vibrant industry. It's fun. You might not think it, but it's full of great people. So hopefully that helps push you in the right direction. But Mary, I would love to spend the next hour talking to you. I think you've brought so many great things to this conversation, but we are out of time today. Thank you again for joining us here. For those of you watching, we are going to have a third and fourth part of this coming up soon. The next part is going to be on creating connections. So if you're interested, stay tuned. That will be coming soon. And yeah, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next video.